Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you're enjoying the content, please drop us up, drop a like, and let us know your thoughts below in the comments. Also, please consider supporting our podcast via the link below. It really helps us out.
Shelly, welcome to the World XP podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. Why don't you, for the people listening, give a quick introduction of yourself, who you are and what you do, kind of what we'll be talking about today. And then we'll go get your thoughts on the question from the last guest, and then we will start to explore the life and the journey of Shelly Moore.
Awesome. My name is Shelly Moore. I've been working as a research scientist, environmental scientist for the last 30 plus years, and mostly studying. I started off as a fish biologist and did some work in that realm and got really interested in looking at trash, particularly plastics. And now am executive director for the Moore Institute for Plastic Pollution Research. And we studied microplastics. So very excited to be in the field that I'm in. And it's a booming field right now with all the stuff that's been happening in the world and all the researchers that have been working on this issue.
Yeah, there's been a few things that have come out in the news recently about microplastics, and I think it's started to become part of the mainstream sort of thinking maybe the last, I don't know, a couple of years. Obviously, you've been researching it for longer, but I think people are starting to pay much more attention to it now. I think I forgot what the stat was, like you ingest a credit card worth of microplastics every like month or week or something crazy like that. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I heard that and I was like, oh.
Yeah, it's in the air we breathe, it's in the food we eat, the liquids we drink. It's just everywhere, even in our homes where, we might have carpet or synthetic curtains and synthetic clothes. We're just finding microplastics everywhere right now.
Yeah. Well, we will definitely dive into that. But before we get to that, the question from the last guest is, what's your favorite cuisine, and in particular, your favorite dish and why?
That's an interesting question. I guess my favorite dish, I really like salmon. That's one of my favorites. Salmon with like a lemon butter and capers, and maybe some green beans and rice. That's one of my favorite dishes. But I'm also a big I love chocolate chip ice cream. That's my favorite flavor of ice cream. So
That's a good one. You can't go wrong with either of those two things. I don't think for sure. I'm a big sucker for some salmon myself. Eat it probably. I don't know if you can eat salmon too much, but maybe that would be me. I don't know. We'll find out one day when Corner cuts me open. They're like, "Well, you smells like salmon." It's like that's not good. Uh okay, so you were talking about you started off as a fish biologist, but how did you what was the like back all the way like you're a little kid, and where did the spark come from of I want to study fish and marine biology and that sort of thing? Like where did that come from? Because I think a lot of people go to the aquarium or whatever and they're like, wow, it's really cool. Um and but then it becomes, at least for me, it was like, wow, that's cool, but I don't really have a desire to go study it. I just like looking at it, or like
Yeah,
seeing the nature. And I think as you go through, at least for me, when I was going through high school, it was like kind of the every narrative, I guess, that I always heard about going into marine biology was a very competitive field. It's very difficult to get into those sorts of, there's like limited numbers of roles and jobs and spots. And it's like, well, if you're not too sure, do something else. It's like I've got friends that went the veterinary track or kind of the animal biologist track, and always getting into like the zoos and the aquariums was always like the hardest thing to do. So, but where did that start for you? Like, what were you just outside and you're like, oh, I like fish, or like, where did that start?
yeah. And I will say that it's been particularly hard for women in the science field as well, particularly when I was much younger. But my interest started with interest in sharks. Whenever we had to do a paper or some type of study for a class in elementary school, I always chose sharks as the topic, and I was just fascinated with them. And Jacques Cousteau and all Eugenie Clark and all those scientists back then and what they were doing. So I remember as a kid, I wanted to go to Marineland and particularly experience Baja Reef, which at the time was unique because they had this area called Baja Reef set aside where you could actually pay to go snorkeling. They would outfit you with a wetsuit and gear, and you could go snorkeling in there. And I remember my mom was terrified of going to places that had the big tanks because she was afraid they were going to break, and she just didn't want to go. And so I remember having to talk some family friends into taking me when they took their children. I begged them to take me as well, and I got to experience the Baja Reef and be underwater and see all the fish they had in that one tank, and that's really where my interest blossomed. Of course, Marineland isn't around anymore, but I still have a lot of interest in fish and swimming and all kinds of marine stuff. As a matter of fact, our lab here is right on the bay, and I get to see the ocean every day. Oftentimes get to see marine mammals on the docks down here, fish in the water. I actually have a window that faces the water, and one time I just happened to look up as a dolphin was going by. So I'm just totally fascinated with marine life and everything in the water.
That's awesome. Oh, what a view. I need to get out there one day.
Yeah, come
Okay,
visit us.
so I will. I'll try to make it happen at some point for sure. I've been to other parts of California, like the Bay Area, up to San Francisco. Um, and there's like the weather obviously amazing. Got to see all the sea lions and seals and stuff down there. It was super cool. Like out by Pebble Beach, the golf course and stuff,
Mm,
but what did we do? We had those like electric bike things that we went
cool.
on the roads by there. So that was really cool. That was a really cool experience for sure. It smelled horrendous, but that's a different story for a different day. Um, but okay, so you get interested in it, and then kind of what's the school path for you? Like where are you like what's the path at that point? Is it biology in college, or like is there a degree for marine biology, or like where's kind of like high school going into college? Did you have that path kind of set out, or were you still? And we're back, technical difficulties, but it's all right. These things happen.
Yeah.
So college, what was the degree, or like what was the path from like high school going into college, or what was the mindset, the thought process? Were you only looking at schools that had that specific degree, or kind of how walk me through how that process worked for you?
Yeah. So since I was interested in marine life, it really was fortuitous that I lived so close to California State University in Long Beach, because they had a great marine biology program. They were known for it, and I was able to get in. So right here at the beach, I got to do a whole bunch of pretty cool studies and help out with a lot of cool projects. And so I was happy to come here and do that work. I was fortunate. I got to go out on a boat with a professor. His name was Don Nelson, and he was really famous in the shark industry. He's on many old National Geographic films, and he was an animal behaviorist. And it was the first time I felt like a real Jacques Cousteau going out on the ocean. We were tracking torpedo rays. There are these electric rays that live right off the coast here in Southern California, and we would put hydrophones down in the water and listen to the transmitters. We had some divers had fed to the torpedo rays, and we all as undergrads would take shifts and for a few hours. I think I had the 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. shift with another a student. And so we were driving around all off of Palos Verdes here in California, looking to see where they were going within the coast area. We could track them based on how well we could hear the signal. And then we'd go back to Don Nelson's boat and sleep and wait for the next shift. So it was super cool. And I was totally excited and knew I wanted to be a marine biologist at that point for sure.
Yeah, 100%. So what like just generally, when you're tracking, whether it's those rays or sharks or whales, or like when you put a tracker on one of these animals, what kind of, like, what are you looking for? Obviously they go places, but
Mhm.
what's the idea, and what do you gain from that information? It's like, okay, they go from here to here. It's like, so what? What are you guys gaining from that information, and how does that help the the field, but also just the knowledge base of biology, marine biology in general, put it, like, starting to put the pieces together of the ecosystems and the various things. Like, what's the so what for a lot of those information, a lot of that information, because you see it on National Geographic all the time. They're like, oh, we put a tracker on this thing. It's like the normal person like me is like, okay, and you
So
know,
what?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, for the torpedo rays, it could actually give a lot of great information. It's not a fish that people eat, so it's more seeing where they're at a given time of day, given time of year. I will say that they're usually in places where people go night diving, and they're very active at night. And so it's important to know that, because there have been instances where they found divers and they thought that maybe they got zapped by an electric ray. Because we have lobster seasons out here, and people go out looking for lobsters at night. And so knowing where they're moving and what times they're moving, it would be important for divers to know. You can also get an idea of, what time of year do they reproduce? Do they move offshore during the day, come back inshore at night? What are they going up north at certain times of the year? And knowing that information could be very valuable to things that people might be doing underwater at given times of the year.
That makes total sense. So, okay, so you got that project in college.
Yep.
Um, did you ever have a plan B? Like, let's just say hypothetically you didn't get into the school or whatever. Like, did you have a plan B, or was it all this, you were all in and you were gonna cross that bridge if once you got there, and hope you never did?
Yeah, I always hoped it would work out that I would go into this field. I did have another job while I was in school, which I could have stayed at for indefinitely, probably. I worked at Disneyland while I was in school, and I was actually in the custodial department. So it actually kind of piqued my interest in trash and other types of issues around having, large amounts of people. We're in urban areas, so lots of trash around there. And Disneyland was a good place to watch littering habits for people and other types of behaviors for them. So I could have always stayed at Disneyland and worked my way up there into different departments and things like that. And I have friends who have done that and have been very successful. But I always knew that I wanted to be a marine biologist. And so I got my bachelor's degree in marine biology, and then I went on to get my master's degree in biology, and I studied a fish off our coast called the white croaker. And white croaker is a fish that lots of people like to eat because it has a very high lipid content, and that typically is better tasting to most people. And I looked at a bone with inside their skulls called the otolith. And otoliths have traditionally been used to age fish. They're kind of like trees, where you cut a slice out of the tree and you can see the rings. Well, you can do the same thing with an otolith. You can count the number of rings and estimate how old the fish is. And so I did that for white croaker, and I looked at two different populations, one in an impacted area. We have a history here in Southern California of DDT, a chemical that was used as a pesticide back in the 60s, and there was a lot of effects to marine life off our coast here. So I looked at a population of fish that was in an area known to be higher in DDT, and then an area that was considered a reference area. And I didn't really find a lot of differences in those populations, other than the fish in the reference area got to be larger in size. And the fish in the more polluted area didn't live as long. But I didn't do any follow up on that. That was
Hmm.
the crux of the research. So it was an interesting study, and I actually got hired by a sanitation district shortly after that to do a project and look at the same species of fish and do some more otolith work. So it was really cool to be able to do that.
So that's a nice jump off then from school into like the working world, I guess. Was it a pretty easy transition given that you were studying the same thing, or were you, well, yeah, I guess, was it English? Was it an easy transition for you, or did you have kind of some time where you weren't sure exactly where you wanted to go? Um, like how does that work? Because as we mentioned earlier, there's limited kind of marine biologist things to do in the world. So did you have an idea of what you wanted to do, or was that the first thing that kind of they were like, "Hey, do you want a job?" And you're like, "Yes, please. I'll take a paycheck so I'm not homeless."
Yeah, so I was very fortunate. I worked with, or I was a student at the time with another gentleman who actually had a job at a place that did research, and he saw an opening there and let me know about it. And I ended up working with a guy. His name was Jim Allen, and he was known as probably one of the best ichthyologists here on the
What
West Coast.
what is an ichthyologist?
A person who studies fish.
Ah, okay,
Um,
that makes sense.
so yeah, and his specialty were trawl caught fish. He actually went out on most of the boats at the sanitation districts here in Southern California. The sanitation districts are required through permits because they discharge treated wastewater offshore. They have to have permits to do that, and part of their permits require them to go off and do some trawling and look at invertebrate populations and fish populations to make sure their discharge isn't impacting the fish and invertebrates offshore. They do other things like test the sediment in the water for quality and chemicals and things like that. But I was really interested in looking at the fish and invertebrate communities, and he specialized in that. So it was super cool to work for somebody with such great knowledge. He could tell you stories about all the different fish, and just I called him the encyclopedia of fish, because you'd mention a fish and he would tell you some weird story about why they were named what they were named, and knew the whole history of it. So it was super cool. And then I got to work for him for many years, and we wrote and analyzed data, wrote reports on fish communities here in Southern California as part of a large survey called the Southern California Bite Program. And basically every 5 years that program happens, and many agencies go out and collect fish, invertebrates, and other parameters. Eventually, we ended up collecting information on trash, which is where I got started down the road of looking at trash specifically, not just the fish and invertebrates, but the larger trash that came in the nets when we collected the fish and invertebrates.
Yeah, that makes sense. It seems like trash has been completely intertwined and and almost the whole time. Where did the interest in sharks wane, or was it kind of a um a switch by necessity from you? Like as you were younger, you were super interested in sharks, and then now you're studying fish and invertebrates. Um, did was that a shift in you, or just kind of where the winds took you in over the course of your school and career up to that point?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of both. I started studying fish. I took an ichthyology class before I graduated, and really started to appreciate fish. And I started scuba diving very regularly. And I was one of those type of scuba divers where I could sit in one place for as long as I could stay down and be perfectly content just watching all the activity around me. Watching a single fish and how they interacted with other fish and the environment around them. One of my most memorable dives was a dive out at Catalina, and we were on this boat that had a speaker system, And so they played classic rock while we were diving, and we could totally hear the music. And it was a shallow water dive, and we just stayed in one spot and watched fish and listened to music and had a really good time. And it also helped in finding the boat after the dive was over. So because we could use the sound to guide us. There was another dive I did out at Anacapa Island, which is part of the Channel Islands, and it was a night dive, and it was just amazing. I was scared to death to do it, and my good friend Sharon went down on the dive with me, and we were down for over an hour. And at one point, she convinced me to turn my flashlight off, which even frightened me more. But I'm so glad I did that, because when I turned the flashlight off, I could see her barely moving her hand through the water. And the only reason I could see her moving her hand through the water is because there were small animals that were bioluminescing as she moved her hand. So it was lighting up a little bit. And I'm so grateful for that experience. And diving at night, you get to see a whole different bunch of fish. Because the day fish go and hide out in the crevices within the reef, and then the night fish come out. And so you're seeing different types of sharks, different types of reef fish. It was really super cool.
This might be a very dumb question to you, but I've always wondered, how do fish sleep? Or do they at all?
They have resting. They do rest. So I'm not sure that any fish would ever sleep. But they
Yeah.
become less active just because of the nature of the reef and all the other fish. They got to be on constant watch for sure. So they just become mostly just less active.
And they just want to find like a place to hide or whatever and chill out
Yeah,
for a few hours and then they go about whatever they were doing before.
yeah, yeah.
Interesting. I always wondered that, especially with sharks, like bigger sharks or whales or things like that. It's like, do they sleep ever? It's like I feel like that would be not wise to just lay in the ocean somewhere. Somebody will come get you.
Yeah.
Um, so for scuba diving, I would imagine you had to get certified and stuff. Was that how early on was that in your marine biology? Was that college time and at what point was like where does that mix in, right? Because you can study the fish and you can go out and see them on boats and stuff, but scuba is a little bit more is that like a requisite for what you were doing? Because it seems a bit more intense than maybe is necessary. I don't know. I'm just speaking from the outside and like what I know of it and what it seems, but it seems so like where did that part come for you?
Yeah, so it was never a requirement of any of the jobs that I had, and it wasn't a requirement for school either. But it was an interest of mine, so I always kind of laughed about it because diving for me was recreational. It wasn't something that I did as part of my job. But I think it did enhance my ability at my job, particularly understanding more about the fish and where they hung out and how they interacted with one another. But it was never a requirement. I'm kind of glad about that because I know people where it was a requirement for them, and oftentimes it was pretty stressful because you have to go out and collect samples, and if you're unsuccessful, you can miss a window of opportunity that maybe was expected. You were expected to be able to collect those samples, but with diving, safety is always first. So if the conditions are bad, you're not going to be able to go out. And it turns out, and I hate to admit this, but I get very seasick. So it's always a challenge for me to be on a boat. And the more often I would go out on boats, the less seasick I would get. But if you're not going out on boats regularly, yeah, I get very seasick. So and sometimes I wonder if it's the type of boat, because diesel fumes really make me nauseous. I went out on a boat off of San Miguel Island one time, and it was a regular gas powered boat, and it was the snottiest weather I think I've ever been in, and the boat was just bouncing all over the place, and I didn't feel sick at all. So I always wonder if it has to do with the type of gas the vessel's using as well. So
Yeah, it's the diesel. You don't get seasick. No, not you. Couldn't be you. Uh,
It happens to a lot of people. I actually knew a marine biologist um, who didn't know how to swim. So
Oh
and
no.
he worked in the field. I think he's still working in the field. He's about ready to retire, but it was never a requirement of his job that he go in the water, so he never had to know how to swim.
That's
But it's marine
wild.
biology.
Like I guess it makes sense like how you say it, but it's still that's crazy. Um,
Yeah.
okay, so the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, is that the sanitation or sanitary districts and stuff, or is that after?
No, so that was basically my first job in the field, and I was there for 25 years doing research. And
How did you get that? What was the transition like and the application process and the like what do they ask for the papers that you wrote when you were in school, or do they like put fish on a screen? They're like, "Hey, what's that one?" What
no, no,
like
no.
how does it work?
So how it worked was I had a fellow fellow student was already working there. He told me about an opening. I applied, and I went in for an interview with Jim Allen, Dr. Jim Allen, the ichthyologist there, and I just told him about my experience and some of the projects I had already worked on. And what was funny was he didn't say a word to me. He thanked me for coming in, and I drove straight from the interview to my apartment. And there was a message on my answering machine saying, you have the job if you want it. And so between the time I left and the time I got home, he decided I was good for the job and called and let me know that I had it. So that started a long experience with just working at a place where we did really interesting research. I loved my job there. There were other aspects that I didn't love so much about it, but the job itself I really enjoyed and had a good time. And I worked in the fish biology department for a number of years, and then went into data and information management. So I was really good with data analysis and those kinds of things too. So in databases, and so I kind of moved over into that. But because I was still at the same place, I got to see all the cool stuff that was being done with looking at fish and vertebrate communities and just a whole plethora of different things that they were looking at.
How did you or the project or the well group, I guess, decide on what things to research? Was it there's some environmental event that was like, oh, we should look into this, or um somebody was just curious about something, or you guys were working with like a university or a school in the area? How were those decisions made and like the prioritization of different things? Not that, well, I don't know if you know, but like obviously funding, you need funding for different things. Like, hey, we're gonna put X number of dollars on this one, but only Y number of dollars on the other one because somebody else doesn't care about it or does care about it. Like, how were those decisions made? I always wonder that with like research institutes and projects, kind of like how they decide like what to look at.
Yeah, so this particular place is a place that has a commission, and the commission consists of and supports the company through money. And it consists of people who are part of the regulated community and people who are regulators. So the EPA, the State Water Board are on the commission, and they supply money to this organization. The regulated people include the stormwater agencies, the sanitation districts, and they would supply money to us as well. So most of the projects that we worked on had to do with what was important to them.
Mm.
So what's important to them is to be able to say, you know, how well am I doing compared to everybody else in this region? And that's basically how the BITE project was, the comprehensive project was born, where a whole bunch of agencies went out all over Southern California and looked at, you know, the fish and vertebrate communities, the sediment, the water, all kinds of different aspects of the environmental health off our coast. And that gave these agencies the opportunity to say, well, I'm in this part of the region, and this is how I look compared to the region as a whole. or this is how I look compared to, San Diego region or Santa Barbara region or anything like that. They could then make comparisons and see how well they were doing. So it was very attractive to them to find that out. And we could identify any problematic areas as well. If we saw some higher values of DDT or something like that in particular areas, we would know that that was a little bit unusual compared to the rest of the area.
That makes sense. Was the nature of those projects fairly similar for the time that you were there? Or was there any like notable ones that you got to work on? Did you have a favorite? I don't know, does a favorite count, I guess?
Yeah.
Were there any notable ones or favorites that you had during your time there?
Yeah, my favorite project was a project I got to work on with a coworker who eventually became a really good friend of mine. And that was a project around something called areas of special biological significance. And there's 34, what we call them ASBSs, in California on the coast. And there are 14 in Southern California, and the rest are in Northern Central California. And we got to go out and sample all 14 of the Southern California ones. And darn, somebody had to do it, but we got to walk every single one of them. So 22, I think it was 22 miles of beach in Malibu, and in LA area. We got to do beaches in San Diego. I actually, as part of that project, got to fly over to San Clemente Island, which is a military island, as well as San Nicolas Island. And that was really cool. I also got to go on a boat and go to each one of the Channel Islands. So that was cool. And essentially what we were doing is looking if there was any sign of discharge into these areas that could potentially impact the biological communities in the water. And so for instance, we walked the 22 miles in Malibu, and we had a GPS, and the GPSs back in that time were huge. The one we took was a backpack GPS. We had an antenna sticking out, and we were walking along the beach, and everybody would want to know what we were doing, and we would GPS every pipe that was flowing into the ocean from land. And at the time, there was a big helicopter survey being done of Malibu and in areas in California, and they had identified this pipe coming out from this Stars home on the beach in Malibu, and so of course we took a look to see if we actually captured that pipe in our survey, and we had. So a whole bunch of different things happened on that trip. At that time, I think it was around 9/11, and right after that we surveyed the area near San Onofre, the nuclear power plant here in Southern California, and we had a park ranger come up to us and say, you might want to leave because I'm pretty sure there are people at the power plant that have their guns pointing in your direction right now because they don't understand what you're doing. You have this big antenna coming out of your backpack, and you might want to get out of here. So we didn't question it. We just took off and did the rest of the survey via maps because we didn't want to cause any problems.
Yeah, or get shot.
Or get shot, yeah. And we also came across a few of the nude beaches here in Southern California as well. Those we didn't know about, and so
Surprise.
we had adventures everywhere we went. So my friend and I would get up early, and she wasn't a morning person, so it was a fun time. We picked on each other a lot, and yeah, it was great to be outside doing that survey, and it actually got a lot of we got a lot of kudos for that project because we tracked everything that was a potential source of contamination into those areas. And years later, even I was still getting requests for the map of all those pipes coming out. So it was a great project.
That's gotta feel cool to like years later have somebody reach back out and say, "Hey, do you still have that thing that you did for like a while ago?" Yeah, that's that's gotta be cool.
Yeah.
Um, I see. So obviously when we spoke before and I was looking at your LinkedIn and stuff, because I want to spend a good chunk of time on the institute, but I want to the COVID time frame looks like around the COVID time frame when it started. Looks like you left the research project and started two new things at San Francisco Estuary Institute, and then also you became an adjunct professor. Why or what was you just ready for a shift in life, or kind of like what happened with that? What was the thought process? Had you considered going back to be a professor prior to this, or did the right offer just come along, or kind of what happened with the transition? Because you're at the other place for 25, 26 years. So what was the thought
Mhm.
process for you, like mentally, like not necessarily um like in the day to day leading up to that, where you're just like, oh, I need a change, or like what was going on with you?
Yeah. So, there, yeah, I've been there for 25 years. Like I said, I loved my job. There were some things about it that I didn't like, and that was what contributed to me leaving. And it had more to do with who was running the company at the time, and their philosophy on leading and things like that. So I wanted to experience some new things because I had been there for so long, and I had taught before, and I always knew that when I got a little bit older, I wanted to go back and have an influence on the younger generation. And so I got the offer to teach at Santa Ana College, teach environmental biology, which is, what I worked in forever. And I just love it. I've had some really super great classes there. And every time I get ready to say, oh, I'm gonna quit and just focus on the Moore Institute, I have a student come up to me and say something super cool and super nice, and then I don't want to quit anymore. So this semester I had a student say, this class has changed my life. And I want to have that impact on younger people, and just teach them all about what we're doing to our environment and how they can change things and impact what's happening. So I started there, and then in San Francisco Estuary Institute, I had been working with them for a long time as part of the other company I was with, and essentially, I was finishing up a project that we had been working on. We wrote and did some research to write the California Trash Monitoring Playbook. So it was all about methodologies and things like that to look at trash in the environment. And so I finished up that project, and then I got a phone call from Captain Charles Moore, who's known famously known for discovering the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. The two of us have been colleagues for probably 25 years, and 25 plus years. He has the same last name as me, but we always talk about we're not related. Because I've had people ask me, "Is that your husband?" Or he's been asked, "Is that your wife?" And no, we're not related at all. But we've been colleagues for a very long time, and I got a phone call from him, and there's another nonprofit here in Long Beach called Algalita, and Algalita uh, used to do research, but they wanted to focus more on education because they're so amazing at doing education. And so they called me to see if I was interested in perhaps heading up and leading a new organization focused around doing research on microplastics. So that's kind of where the Institute got its start. And it was right at the beginning of COVID, and when everything shut down. So it was a little bit challenging at first, but things are starting to really roll right now. So yeah, right when the pandemic was breaking loose, I was up in Seattle. I have served on the board of directors for the Southern California Academy of Sciences for about 12 years. And the last 2 years I've been president. And essentially the goal of the academy is to encourage communication between students and professional scientists. And so we have people on our board who are scientists in a number of different capacities, many of them at universities, organizations like mine, and we provide training for high school students in science, and we also provide grants for college students. And so I was up in Seattle, and we were part of the AAAS meeting up there, and it was really cool because we were actually visiting the University of Washington and the virology lab at the time that COVID was breaking. And so the scientists up there and the professors were giving us updates on what they thought was going to happen. And it turns out what they thought was going to happen isn't what happened, because everything ended up shutting down. And we made it home right before they stopped all the planes and everything. So we got to actually see Bill Gates as part of a plenary up there, and he actually talked about situations such as the pandemic and some of the things that he had been involved in regarding those kinds of things. So it was an interesting trip, and glad we got home when we did, and yeah, it just seemed like everything was moving in the direction where the Moore Institute and teaching was going to be my thing. So
Yeah, how was that transition for you in terms of it's a big change from one place for so long to all of a sudden COVID and you're wearing three hats. Um, well, yeah, three-ish hats. Um, how was did you have difficulty structuring your day, time management, or did everything kind of bleed together in the way that since they're all related, you were able to use some of the stuff you were doing at one project and you were able to go teach it, and then it was informing what you were doing at the institute, or what was that like for you? Because it's totally different from, not that your job before was a normal 9 to 5 or whatever, but going from 9 to 5 where everything is kind of structured for you in a way to now you are structuring everything that you're doing and you're kind of in charge of what you're doing. How was that difficult for you, or was it seamless, like especially with COVID happening at the same time?
it was super difficult. At school, I was everything's electronic now. They've got electronic systems for reporting grades and everything. So I was trying to learn all of that stuff at the same time. And I was very fortunate. The person who asked me to teach shared some teaching materials with me, because if I would have had to create all that stuff brand new, it would have taken me forever. And it was extremely hard to focus on working during that time because of what was going on in the world. I just remember watching the news and just sitting there in disbelief over everything that was happening, and yeah, having to learn the electronic systems, having to go to Zoom to teach, Zoom for meetings. It was really super hard.
But you got through it and now you're on the other side. Yeah. So,
Yes, yes.
um, so talk to me about the Moore Institute and what you guys are up to and kind of the implications for, um, I'll say like the regular people like me who are not living and breathing the, well, I am living and breathing microplastics, but who are not living and breathing like the industry or the field that you're in all the time day to day. What are some of the things that you guys are working on, and what are some of the takeaways for us non-marine biology people?
Yeah, yeah. So in 2018, there was some legislation that was passed here in California. There were actually two bills passed. One had to do with drinking water and microplastics in drinking water, and it required the state water board here in California to do a few things. And the first thing was to develop a definition of microplastics, which you might think it would be easy, but there was a lot of effort put into developing the definition that they have. And it had to go through a really long and arduous review process. So that has been done. They do have a definition for microplastics, and we're also required to come up with some methods for looking at microplastics. And you would think, oh, everybody's looking at it right now. Everybody's probably doing a similar method, but no, everybody's was doing a different method. So the plan was to find a method that everybody could use with a little bit of flexibility for differences, but mostly consistent in what everybody was doing. And so there was an intercalibration laboratory study done where labs from all over the world participated in analyzing samples that had been spiked with microplastics. And so it was clean water, dirty water. The dirty water was to simulate storm water, fish tissue, and sediment. And I had actually called Woods Hole on the East Coast and asked them for if they had any soils or sediment samples that we could have that were pre the creation of plastics. And so they had some soil cores that they had taken and collected before plastics were even invented. And so they were able to share that as part of the study, which was really cool. Because nowadays everything's so contaminated, it's hard to get, clean anything. So that was used, and the study was done, the results came out, and that informed the method that was eventually approved by the State Water Board for use by people to become accredited in looking at microplastics. So we are now in the process of getting accredited. I apologize for the noise outside. I'm next to a brewery. My office is right next to.
I can't hear it. You're all good.
Oh, cool. And their forklift is going by right now. Anyway, we had an assessor come in March to look at our methods around microplastics in drinking water. And we are officially have applied for accreditation, and we're just waiting to hear back right now. It's looking good, and we're hopeful that any day now we'll hear back from them, and we'll become one of the first accredited labs for microplastics anywhere in the world, and certainly the first nonprofit ever accredited by the State Water Board program. So we're excited about that.
That's super cool. That's you're on the cutting edge of that for sure. How difficult was it to stand up the institute? Obviously, I would imagine obviously you had some help, but was that the word difficult doesn't really capture what I mean to ask. Well, I guess what I mean to ask is the learning curve of running a nonprofit, the business/legal side of things, the decisions on, okay, now we have to go get funding to do these things. My wife used to work for a nonprofit, and they're always at different conferences saying, hey, we're doing this research, but we need funding from this person or that person or this philanthropist or this foundation was willing to donate. And they have people that like their whole job is that. So kind of the learning curve of all of these things, walk me and I guess the listener as well through all of those things as well.
Yeah. So the learning curve was very stressful, especially since my background is in research, not in running a nonprofit. But I was fortunate. I had a lot of help. As I said, Algalita, our sister organization, has been around for over 30 years. And their executive director, Katie Allen, was very helpful in helping with everything. I remember getting a contract in the mail in via email, and having to read that contract and just was like, I don't even know the answer to that question. Help. and I would ask as many people as I needed to find answers. And finally, I know this is probably not the best way of doing it, but the way I got around it was I was not being malicious in anything I was doing. I was trying to be truthful and honest in everything I was doing. And I did the best I could with it. And if I answered a question incorrectly, it wasn't done maliciously. So that's how I was able to move forward in most cases. And yeah, it helps asking people questions, especially people who are already doing it. So, but it was challenging at first. I'm getting more and more comfortable with it. The challenge I have now is I'm really interested in the research part, but mostly I do paperwork and things like that. So I'm as long as we're making a difference, I'm happy about it. The other thing that happened was we had an angel investor come in, and It's an interesting story because it was an email that was sent to Algalita's executive director, Katie, and it went into her junk folder. And she just happened to be looking in her junk folder, and it was this, hey, do you need, I'm looking for someone to help support and doing research on plastics. Do you guys need any help? And she was hesitant to respond, but went ahead and did so anyway. And it turns out this foundation has helped us tremendously, has helped us with equipment, has helped us with salaries and all kinds of different things. And we're so appreciative of them for helping us out. And we couldn't have done it without them. So we were very fortunate that we connected with the right person at the right time. Certainly we've had other people helping us out, and we're a little bit different from Algalita in the sense that they do a lot of foundation. They get a lot of support through foundations. We get a lot of contract work. We've been looking at microplastics in drinking water from the state of New York and other places. We've also done some work on what else have we done? Some wastewater treatment plants looking at microplastics. And we've got a whole bunch of samples in the lab right now. We also want to support students, and students, that's been one of the highlights for me, is being able to help students out. Many of the students studying microplastics today are in biology majors or environmental majors, and they don't have access to equipment that you would typically find in chemistry labs. They might have them in their chemistry labs at the school they're at, but they don't have access to them because they're in biology. And so we've had students from UCLA, UC Riverside, Cal State Long Beach, even up in Humboldt, from Humboldt, come down and use our equipment. And the projects they've been working on have been really interesting. Microplastics coming out of commercial laundromats, microplastics in plants around playgrounds and other types of areas, microplastics in snow, all kinds of different projects. And very interesting, and we're so happy to be able to help out students.
What are some of the implications of your findings for just like the world generally? Like, what are some of the things that you guys have found? What are some of the, like we talked about the so what's earlier, like what are some of the implications, and what do those things mean for the world kind of going forward? I think sometimes you hear people say, well, people say they're concerned about the environment, and then they go fly on a private jet, which dumps a gazillion pounds of diesel fuel. And it's like me changing one plastic straw for a paper straw versus the private jet is like what is it? What difference does that make? It's like what kind of implications and things are you guys finding, and what's the so what's, I guess, for those?
Yeah, the implications are really that we don't even know what the impact is on on human bodies right now. I mean, they're starting to look at the impacts, but most of the work has traditionally been on birds and other animals, and there's impacts on them. So we know that the implications are there. I think from our perspective, we really want to impact policy around microplastics. California has been very progressive in passing policy around trash and larger items above 5 millimeters, but they haven't done a lot for things for plastics less than 5 millimeters. And so we really want to impact policy. We want people to understand that what they're doing is harmful. And I use the example with my students all the time. I say, how many of you drink water out of plastic water bottles, the single-use plastic water bottles? And like every single one of them raises their hands. And I say, how many of you leave those plastic water bottles in your car once in a while and still drink out of them after they've been warmed up? And they, raise their hands. And I said, warming plastic up basically encourages the leaching of chemicals out of those plastics. And not only that, but every time you take the cap off off your plastic water bottle, you're increasing the number of microplastics in that water bottle. And there's been studies on bottled water versus tap water, and so just getting people to understand how much they're ingesting and how much their potential for having problems is. And I tell the students, I say, you're not going to notice any differences physically, not necessarily. It's all happening at a molecular level and within your body, and eventually it may catch up to you. I mean, I give them examples of, the impact of something like DDT and how that impacted the pelicans back in the 70s and their ability to reproduce and have viable eggs, and give them some examples of cases where we've seen some issues, and people just didn't even realize how it was connected to pollutants we're putting into our environment. So yeah, I'm really want to affect policy, want to impact as much as we can what people do. And I get the question all the time, what is something I can do to lessen my impact? And I always tell people to start off small and build up from there. And usually I recommend you take a look at your single-use plastics, especially your foodware. You go to a fast food place and everything comes in plastic. You got plastic utensils, plastic straw, plastic everything. And you could start there. You're gonna make an impact. So I tell them about some of the things that I do, and I'm not perfect. It's just too much of a convenience sometimes when you're out and about, particularly when you're traveling, because they don't always let you take your reusable bottle full into the airport. You have to empty it out and then fill it somewhere else. And I remember being frustrated on a plane one time because they wouldn't let me fill my bottle. They wanted me to take the plastic bottle instead. So sometimes they don't let you get away with it. I remember the only store it ever happened to me at, if I would go into a grocery store, I would only pick up a couple items. I say, I don't want a bag. I'll just carry the stuff.
Yeah.
And I went to Sears one time and I bought an item of clothing, and I said, I don't want a bag. I just want to carry it out. And they said, you have to have a bag. And at that point I realized it was because it was a security thing.
Yeah.
And so I took the bag at that point, but in some cases they make it difficult for you to do that kind of stuff. So
Yeah. The molecular level thing that you mentioned is I think very important. It comes in the form of things that we eat and all the chemicals and preservatives and stuff in the food, right? We see a lot of people with chronic inflammation,
yeah.
and various allergies and kind of chronic diseases that weren't really around 40, 50 years ago. So I think with the food, the microplastics, everything in the environment is kind of like there's a lot of things that are doing not so great things to us as people. So and we're not really gonna know until one, two, three generations really to see the full effects, and that's kind of nerve-wracking a little bit, but we can only do, I don't know, but so much at this point. Um, so if you had a magic wand, if the Moore Institute was the most powerful entity on the planet, what would be like the top like two or three things that you would enact immediately, whether it's policy or people only drinking out of metal bottles, or like what are the top couple things that if you just had a magic wand you'd be like, and then the world would be better in the world of microplastics, what would those things be?
Yeah, well, the one big thing would be to find an alternative to plastics.
Yeah.
And there's companies all the time creating bioplastics, things that degrade much faster. But in reality, when you've got things going into landfills, you've got things going into the ocean where it's much colder. When you don't have the ability to break things down, it's still going to be around. I have a colleague who does a lot of deep sea work and goes down in submersibles and things, and she started telling me about a lot of the stuff she's seen, a lot of the trash she's seeing down there. And there's that infamous case of the sub that sank. I think it was the Alvin that sank. And there was a scientist who had put a bologna sandwich on in the sub, And when they retrieved the sub from the depths, like 2 or 3 years later, or whatever it was, the bologna sandwich was, I think, still edible because it was
Oh,
such a depth. It was so cold that the bacteria weren't able to start working on it. And
okay,
so,
that's less gross.
yeah. So at depth, you're not going to get a lot of decomposition and things biodegrading. So it just it might work on land where you've got, the sun and warmer atmosphere, but it's not going to work everywhere. So I think the biggest thing would be to create an alternative. And I always tell my students that I'm old enough to remember having milk delivered in glass bottles on my front porch when I was a kid. And it might take going back to doing something like that. I don't know. It's people are so used to convenience nowadays that it makes it harder. But yeah, it would be nice to see people go back to different alternatives. Glass is heavier, it's more expensive, plastic's cheap, and it's convenient. So it's hard to get around that.
Yeah. Well, you have first off, thank you for your time. It was a pleasure to talk to you today. I think definitely the more people know about using glass things or metal things as opposed to the plastics, the better, for sure. But before I let you go, do you have any last nickels before we get you out of here?
I don't really think of anything. I would encourage people to get out in the environment more and take a look at it, appreciate it. I think, there's too many people inside now looking at the screens and not paying attention to our environment. I did something really scary a couple of years ago. And it's probably one of the scariest things I've ever done. There's a company up in the Bay Area. You were talking about the Bay Area earlier, and they have boats and they take swimmers out, and you can swim. You can do the Alcatraz swim. You can do a bunch of different swims up there. And my friends and I decided to go up there and swim from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Bay Bridge, which is about 6 miles. And we split it in half, and two of us did the swim from the Golden Gate Bridge to Alcatraz. And it was so scary because even though I'm a marine biologist and I've always loved sharks and everything, I know that there's great whites out there, and I still wouldn't trade it any of the fear in the world for having done that. It was totally worth it. And like I said, I would encourage people to get out there and challenge themselves and do things like that more often, just so they have a better appreciation for the environment.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And also the thing you said earlier about trying to just be honest and tell the truth. I think those as well super important. I think the more people that are out there telling the truth and being as honest as they can be, the better place the world will be. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Where can the people find the institute, find you if they want to support or help you out, or they're curious about what you guys are doing? Where should they go find you?
Yeah, we have a website. It's moreplasticresearch.org, and more is spelled Moore. And then plasticresearch.org. And we have a donation button where people can contribute, and any donation would be appreciated. We have a young scientist who works here freshly out of getting his PhD, and he's amazing. He's been creating all kinds of tools, and he's all about open data. And so the more support we can get, the more open data and open data tools that we can create, and support for those kinds of things are what we want to do. We want to make sure that people are aware of everything, and not everybody shares their data, and we want to be the opposite of that. We want to be totally upfront and transparent in what we're finding and what we're doing.
Fair enough. Those links for you guys listening, if you're curious, the links will be in the description. And as always, thank you for watching, and we will see you guys next time. Peace.